Late in the summer of 1997, the rural edges of Tampa, Florida, carried the familiar mixture of heat, humidity, and quiet unease that settled over the farmland during the early morning hours. Thick air drifted across pastures and narrow dirt roads, and the darkness remained heavy long after midnight. On the 18th of August, before sunrise, 59-year-old Jack Don Lewis began what appeared at first to be a normal, routine morning. A morning that in retrospect would mark the beginning of one of Florida's most persistent and widely discussed missing person investigations. The darkness outside carried little indication that anything unusual was unfolding. Don was known for waking before dawn, often beginning his day long before others on the wildlife sanctuary properties stirred. He had spent decades building a complex network of business ventures, real estate trades, vehicle sales, exotic animal acquisitions, storage units, and private deals conducted across Florida and Central America. Early mornings were typical for him, and his movements in the hours before sunrise were not unusual. He was known to leave quietly, often driving alone to visit properties or check on equipment without notifying anyone. His independence meant that few questioned his early routines. During those early hours, the property remained still. Large cats inside their enclosures paced slowly in the quiet, nocturnal birds shifted in their roosts, and the air hung thick with the smell of wet soil and tropical vegetation. Buildings around the wildlife sanctuary, which Don co-owned, showed no signs of disturbance. Equipment remained where it had been left, gates were closed, and vehicles sat undisturbed in the gravel parking areas. No neighbors reported unusual movement. Nothing about the property suggested struggle, conflict, or immediate urgency. But as the day progressed, the absence of typical activity began to raise concerns. Don's routines, while often unpredictable in their destinations, were reliable in their pattern. He would leave early, conduct business, and return by midday unless he informed someone otherwise. He kept appointments regularly and managed multiple operations that required consistent oversight. As morning turned to afternoon, the lack of communication became increasingly abnormal. By midday, vehicles that Don normally used remained unaccounted for. His white 1989 Dodge van, typically used for hauling items between properties, was nowhere on the sanctuary grounds. Calls placed to his office went unanswered. Efforts to reach him through contacts involved in his business activities produced no results. Others who were accustomed to receiving calls or instructions from him noted that the silence was unusual. His absence did not align with any scheduled trip, planned meeting, or ongoing business negotiation. Later that day, the first significant development emerged when Don's van was located at Pasco County Airport, a small, lightly used airfield approximately 40 miles from his home. The van was parked neatly, not abandoned, and showed no signs of forced entry or damage. The interior contained a set of keys, though none belonged to the aircraft stored at the airport. The discovery raised immediate questions. Although Don had once flown small planes, his pilot's license had been suspended, and investigators later confirmed that no aircraft had recorded departures connected to him that day. The van provided a location, but not an explanation. Inside the airport, no one reported seeing Don arrive. No fuel purchases had been recorded under his name. The runway logs remained empty of any activity that matched his flight patterns or aircraft usage. The airfield, quiet and lightly staffed, provided no witnesses who could recall a man matching his description passing through the site during the early morning hours. The van's presence offered a starting point, but no clarity regarding his movements. Meanwhile, back at the sanctuary, there were no signs indicating that Don had prepared for a long trip. His passport remained at home, stored among personal documents. Clothing suitable for extended travel had not been removed from his residence. Financial accounts showed no unusual activity. None of the cash reserves he occasionally carried were missing in amounts suggesting a planned departure. His businesses required active management, and no instructions had been left for associates tasked with handling operations in his absence. As investigators retraced Don's known movements and habits, They discovered no clear timeline leading up to his disappearance. His last confirmed sighting occurred the previous evening, with no evidence suggesting he had been distressed or preparing to leave for extended travel. If he had departed intentionally, he left none of the indicators typically associated with planned absence. No financial adjustments, no communication, no preparation. Local law enforcement began the initial steps of a missing person investigation by assessing the property, reviewing access points, and speaking with those who had interacted with Don in the days prior. They examined areas where he routinely worked, storage sheds, equipment buildings, office spaces, and animal enclosures, but found nothing out of place. They inspected vehicles and searched the grounds, looking for any indication that he had attempted to take an aircraft, meet someone, or travel through back roads. The search produced no meaningful clues. The airport remained the only physical connection to his disappearance, yet even that link offered little insight. The van's placement suggested that Don had arrived voluntarily, but the lack of witness accounts, flight records, or camera footage left investigators with no understanding of what happened after the vehicle was parked. The airfield's rural surroundings, open land, tree lines, and small clusters of residential properties offered numerous paths a person could walk unnoticed. Yet there were no signs that Don had traveled on foot from the site. No footprints were reported, and no personal items were discovered along the nearby roads or wooded areas. By the end of the first day, the search had widened, but the lack of immediate clues meant that the investigation was already beginning to resemble a long-term missing person case. Don Lewis had vanished from a region where travel patterns are typically traceable, where vehicles and aircraft leave records, and where early morning movement is limited. Yet he appeared to have left no trace at all. The sanctuary, the airport, and the surrounding roads offered no evidence of direction, intention, or destination. His disappearance began not with chaos or disruption, but with the quiet absence of a man who had begun the day as he always did, and then never returned. Before the morning of his disappearance, Don Lewis's life was shaped by decades of work spent building an unusual combination of business ventures that stretched across Florida and reached into Central America. Born in 1938 in rural Florida, Don developed a reputation early in life for his relentless work ethic, resourcefulness, and ability to capitalize on opportunities others overlooked. He began with modest means, undertaking small trades, repairing equipment, and buying undervalued property. Over time, these efforts expanded into a large network of real estate holdings, rental units, storage facilities, salvage vehicles, heavy equipment, and private deals conducted both formally and informally. His financial life was complex, but it reflected a man who valued independence and relied heavily on instinct rather than conventional business structures. Those who worked with Don described him as tireless, a man who rarely rested and who maintained multiple projects simultaneously. He frequently traveled throughout Florida to inspect properties, negotiate transactions, or move equipment. His approach to business was largely self-directed. He preferred to handle negotiations personally and traveled without fanfare, often driving alone before dawn to check on new prospects. He operated with a mixture of formal documentation and informal agreements, sometimes relying on verbal arrangements that he never fully explained to others. This habit made his business footprint wide, but often difficult for outsiders to track. Despite accumulating significant wealth, Don lived modestly in many respects. He wore simple clothing, drove practical vehicles, and maintained a work schedule that left little time for leisure. His financial success came from constant activity rather than a singular enterprise. Associates noted that he rarely separated his personal time from his business hours. He viewed potential deals everywhere: a piece of unused land, a neglected structure, a broken vehicle, or a property in poor condition that others overlooked. He invested in these assets, improved them to varying degrees, and either rented or resold them. This pattern created a network of holdings spread across multiple counties. Don's personal habits reinforced his business identity. He was known for carrying cash, sometimes in large amounts, believing it essential for quick transactions. He kept notebooks with handwritten names, numbers, and details about potential deals. He used multiple storage units to keep equipment, machinery parts, and miscellaneous items he believed might one day become valuable. He often visited these storage areas early in the morning or late at night, organizing or moving items depending on upcoming plans. He also had deep ties to Costa Rica, a country he visited often for business and property acquisitions. Over the years, he purchased land there, established connections, and pursued opportunities he felt were promising. His interest in Costa Rica grew steadily, leading him to spend extended periods exploring investment options. Although he traveled there frequently, he often made these trips without elaborate preparation or detailed itineraries, relying instead on his own comfort with informal arrangements. In the years leading to his disappearance, he had spoken to several people about moving some of his operations, and possibly himself, to Costa Rica more permanently. Within Florida, Doan's world operated largely on the outskirts of traditional business structures. He maintained relationships with lawyers, contractors, property managers, and acquaintances who helped facilitate his deals, but he remained the central figure in all decisions. Those around him sometimes found his methods unconventional, yet they also recognized his success. He trusted his instincts more than formal advice, and he believed in handling matters independently. That independence, while contributing to his success, also created vulnerabilities in the investigation later, as few people had a complete understanding of his activities, schedules, or private arrangements. Don's personal routine reflected the same restless energy that defined his business practices. He woke early, often before 4 a.m., and began working immediately. Sometimes he drove to properties without informing anyone. Other times he inspected equipment, met with associates, or visited storage facilities. He could go hours without contacting anyone, and those who worked with him were accustomed to his unpredictability. His early departures were normal, but his consistency in returning home or checking in later in the day made his disappearance stand out sharply. He also played a major role in the operations at the wildlife sanctuary he co-owned. Though not directly involved in animal care, he managed financial, logistical, and property matters. He acquired animals from auctions, private owners, or organizations, often negotiating deals personally. He maintained the sanctuary grounds, repaired structures, and managed equipment. The sanctuary's operations required daily attention, and Doan's involvement meant he regularly moved between enclosures, storage buildings, and vehicles to keep the facility functioning smoothly. Doan's relationships added further context to his daily life. His marriage, his business partnerships, and his personal connections intersected in ways that reflected his complicated schedule and multi-layered responsibilities. He interacted with staff members, volunteers, business associates, and acquaintances throughout Florida and beyond. These connections were diverse, ranging from property managers and tradesmen to pilots, mechanics, and international contacts. Investigators later found that many individuals had interacted with Don in the weeks prior to his disappearance, but none provided evidence pointing to a conflict, planned departure, or unusual behavior. By the mid-1990s, Doan's life had become a balancing act between his Florida operations and his growing interests in Costa Rica. Financial records, property deeds, and communication logs showed extensive activity in both regions. He had expressed interest in expanding his presence there, though the nature of these plans varied depending on whom he spoke to. Some believed he intended to relocate at least part of his business. Others reported he was seeking a place to retire. Still others recalled him mentioning concerns about the regulatory environment in the United States or expressing interest in spending more time outside the country. These conversations, while informative, lacked concrete timelines or actionable detail. Despite this international activity, Nothing in Don's behavior before the 18th of August suggested an immediate departure or a sudden shift in routine. His schedule in the days leading to the disappearance followed familiar patterns, visiting properties, contacting business associates, and working on tasks at the sanctuary. His passport, required for international travel, remained at home. No reservations or financial transactions suggested imminent overseas plans. His last communications with associates reflected ordinary business matters, with no mention of departures or sudden changes. Taken together, Don Lewis's background presented investigators with a complex life built on independence, constant activity, informal business networks, and a personal schedule that often operated outside standard patterns. This complexity made his disappearance difficult to analyze. His habits explained why leaving early in the morning appeared normal, but they also meant that understanding his exact movements required piecing together a fragmented web of daily routines and activities. By the time the missing person report was formally filed on the 19th of August, 1997, the investigation into Don Lewis's disappearance had already taken on a tone of uncertainty. His daily routines were broad enough to make tracing his exact movements difficult, but familiar enough that his failure to return raised immediate concern. The van located at the small Pasco County Airport provided investigators with the first tangible point in the timeline, yet even that detail added more questions than clarity. Detectives began their investigation at the airport, examining the van in detail. It showed no signs of forced entry, mechanical failure, or sudden abandonment. The doors were locked, and the interior was orderly, consistent with how Don typically kept his vehicles. His keys were found inside, but notably absent were any keys associated with aircraft, an important observation because Don owned several small planes stored at the facility. The absence of aviation keys suggested he had not planned to fly anywhere, voluntarily or otherwise. Airport staff were questioned to determine whether Don had been seen arriving during the early morning hours. None reported observing him. The airport was a small facility with minimal traffic, especially before sunrise. Most flights took place during daylight hours, and the airport did not have extensive monitoring equipment, cameras, or staffed checkpoints. There were no fuel receipts or runway logs indicating that any aircraft had been moved during the relevant time frame. The planes belonging to Don remained undisturbed, and maintenance records showed no recent activity. With no indication that Don had flown out of the airport, investigators turned to the possibility that he had driven the van to the airfield for reasons unrelated to flight. They searched the immediate surroundings, the runway edges, grassy areas, drainage ditches, and tree lines bordering the facility. No footprints or personal items were found. The van's tires showed traces of gravel and dust consistent with normal use, suggesting it had been driven on paved and unpaved roads, but provided no further clues. From the airport, investigators returned to Don's property to establish a clearer understanding of his movements before he vanished. They examined his home, workshops, storage buildings, and the wildlife sanctuary grounds. The property itself was extensive, containing enclosures for big cats, equipment sheds, and various structures used for animal care and business storage. Nothing appeared disturbed. Tools were in their usual places, animals were secured in their enclosures, and paperwork on his desk showed no signs of hurried activity. There were no indications of a struggle, forced entry, or sudden departure. Investigators interviewed staff and volunteers at the sanctuary. They confirmed that Don had been present the day before and that his behavior was typical, engaged in routine discussions, addressing property issues, and tending to administrative tasks. There were no signs he had been preparing for travel, nor had he mentioned any immediate plans requiring an early departure. Several individuals noted that while Don frequently left early in the morning, he usually left instructions or hinted at his intended destinations. This time, however, there had been no such communication. Police then began interviewing business associates, to see whether Don had scheduled any meetings or transactions on the day he went missing. No one reported expecting him. He had recently discussed travel to Costa Rica, but there were no reservations, financial movements, or documented preparations suggesting an imminent trip. His banking activity remained unchanged. His passport, which he would have required, was found inside his home. Investigators reviewed his vehicles, financial accounts, offices, and equipment. They could not identify anything missing beyond the van that had already been found. This lack of missing property eliminated many possibilities of theft or robbery, making foul play less straightforward, but still within consideration. There were no signs of forced access to safes, storage units, or trailers. All of Don's large equipment remained in place. With no immediate physical evidence, detectives searched Don's multiple properties across the region. His holdings were scattered, some active, others in various stages of repair or use. Investigators searched abandoned structures, open fields, pastures, and buildings that contained machinery, tools, and vehicles. They opened containers, checked wells, and examined barns. These searches yielded nothing unusual, and no items appeared out of place. As the investigation expanded, inconsistencies began to emerge, not from physical evidence, but from the absence of it. Don's van being found neatly parked at the airport was unusual, especially since he had no documented reason to be there that morning. His lack of aviation keys suggested he had not intended to fly, but his habit of conducting business informally left open the possibility that he might have met someone there. However, no witnesses could confirm seeing him or anyone else involved in such a meeting. Another inconsistency involved the timeline. For Don to have arrived at the airport early in the morning, he would have needed to leave the sanctuary around dawn, yet no one heard or observed his departure. His animals were secured, and the property showed no signs of hurried or unusual activity. The usual noises of early morning, gates closing, gravel shifting under tires, doors being opened, were not reported by employees or neighbors. Detectives also noted that Don's personal financial records showed no signs of intentional withdrawal or preparation. Individuals planning voluntary disappearance often leave behind indicators, financial adjustments, unusual transactions, or messages hinting at departure. Don's accounts remained stable, his business paperwork was active, and nothing indicated an attempt to reorganize assets. Early theories emerged based on these contradictions. One possibility considered was that Don had driven to the airport to meet someone, either for business or another purpose, and that this meeting had led to circumstances preventing his return. Another theory explored the idea that Don might have been planning to travel to Costa Rica without formal documentation, relying on private arrangements or informal flights. Investigators contacted officials in Costa Rica, checking for any sign of his arrival. None existed. The investigation then considered whether Don had experienced a medical emergency. If he had become disoriented or collapsed, he may have wandered away from the airport. Search teams combed the surrounding fields, wooded areas, and drainage ditches within the airport perimeter. Cadaver dogs were deployed, but no scent trails or findings supported the theory. The area showed no signs of human movement beyond what would be expected for airport maintenance. As the first week progressed, investigators broadened the search radius around the airport. Deputies walked through thick vegetation, checked wildlife areas, and inspected remote properties near the airfield. The ground was uneven, with tall grass, sandy sections, and patches of palmetto scrub. None of these areas revealed disturbances. Detectives began speaking with individuals familiar with the airport and surrounding land, asking whether anyone had observed suspicious activity. Nothing substantial emerged. In the days following the initial investigation, law enforcement began expanding the search radius far beyond the sanctuary grounds and the Pasco County Airport. With no physical evidence to anchor the timeline, investigators were forced to widen their focus to miles of rural land, agricultural fields, drainage canals, and wooded pockets throughout the region. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras circled large sections of property around the airport, scanning for heat signatures, disturbed soil, abandoned structures, or any sign of unusual activity. The flights covered swampland, open pastures, and clusters of trees, yet the scans failed to produce a single anomaly that warranted ground inspection. Ground teams followed these efforts, walking through thick vegetation, dry ditches, and dense palmetto scrub, where visibility dropped sharply. These areas were methodically divided into grids, and deputies moved through each section, documenting terrain and checking for footprints, clothing, or discarded belongings. Cadaver dogs accompanied several teams, trained to detect scent associated with human remains, even in difficult environments. Despite extensive passes, the dogs made no credible indications. Without a scent trail or piece of trace evidence, search coordinators had no direction to refine the efforts, leaving them with vast open land and no focal point. Simultaneously, investigators began collecting information related to Don's aviation history. Although his pilot's license had been suspended, he still owned multiple small aircraft stored at private airfields. Detectives inspected the planes where they were kept, checking fuel levels, maintenance logs, and mechanical conditions. All aircraft were accounted for, and none showed signs of recent operation. Aviation administrators confirmed that no flights matching Don's planes or flight patterns had occurred around the date of the disappearance. Investigators also examined private airstrips, some located on rural properties known for informal use, but none reported activity involving Don. As the aviation angle produced no leads, investigators turned their attention to Don's extensive financial and property dealings. They reviewed contracts, loan documents, sale records, and storage unit inventories, searching for patterns or unusual transactions. Don's business papers were stored in multiple locations, including safes, office files, and personal notebooks. These documents showed continuous activity, with several pending deals that required follow-up. There were no signs he had withdrawn large sums of money or repositioned assets for a sudden departure. His financial behavior in the days before he vanished appeared steady and consistent with his normal operations. Investigators also contacted officials in Costa Rica to explore whether Don had entered the country through unofficial channels. He had a history of traveling there both formally and informally, and over the years he had discussed long-term plans related to properties he owned there. Costa Rican authorities checked airports, border logs, and private landing reports, but found no trace of him. Individuals familiar with Don's properties in Costa Rica confirmed they had not seen him, received communication from him, or observed any changes, suggesting he had arrived unexpectedly. This absence of activity, combined with the fact that his U.S. passport remained at home, significantly weakened the theory that he had traveled to Central America voluntarily. Detectives next reviewed Don's network of business contacts to identify anyone he might have met on the 18th of August. They interviewed dozens of individuals who worked with him in real estate, equipment resale, animal acquisition, and storage operations. None reported meeting him that day. No one mentioned arranging early morning appointments or expecting him for any negotiations. Many noted that while Don frequently made last-minute decisions, he usually indicated when he intended to meet someone. His lack of communication on that morning did not fit his typical pattern. Investigators also analyzed his communications. Phone records did not show unusual call patterns, and there were no outgoing calls or contacts indicating planned travel. No messages hinted at distress, conflict, or major changes. The absence of digital footprint activity, though less sophisticated in 1997 compared to modern standards, nonetheless indicated that the disappearance was neither planned nor accompanied by the typical preparations of someone attempting to abandon their life. During this stage, the investigation identified contradictions that deepened the mystery. One inconsistency involved Don's international travel habits. While he traveled frequently to Costa Rica, He always used his passport. He traveled with cash, but he did not travel without documentation. The fact that his passport remained at home challenged the idea of intentional departure. Another contradiction emerged from the location of his van. If he intended to fly somewhere or meet someone at the airfield, investigators expected to find some indication of preparation, such as aircraft fuel, operational logs, or witness reports. Instead, everything at the airport was stagnant. A third contradiction involved his ongoing business activities. Don was involved in several transactions requiring his follow-up. Days before he vanished, he had initiated conversations about deals that required immediate attention. There were no cancellations, no instructions for others to take over, and no signs he was preparing to step away from his responsibilities. His businesses were too active and too dependent on his oversight for a voluntary disappearance to go unnoticed. As investigators continued gathering information, the search radius widened even further. Deputies inspected abandoned barns, remote buildings, uninhabited homes, and open fields across neighboring counties. Several properties, some owned by Don and others connected to his business dealings, were entered and searched with permission. These properties varied in condition. Some were functioning rentals, others were old structures slowly deteriorating in the Florida heat. None of them revealed evidence suggesting recent presence, struggle, or concealment. Search teams also returned to the wildlife sanctuary, expanding their inspection beyond the main grounds. They examined distant sections of the property, including areas used for equipment storage and old structures on the borders of the land. Investigators inspected nearby wooded areas and natural water features that bordered the sanctuary. These repeated searches added to the growing list of locations eliminated from consideration. As the investigation widened, the lack of evidence became more pronounced. In cases involving vehicles, business connections, and multiple locations, investigators typically uncover some trace: a witness sighting, a piece of clothing, a financial transaction, or a phone call. Here, none existed. The disappearance had occurred quietly, without disruption, and with no trail to follow. As the investigation progressed beyond the initial search efforts, detectives intensified their focus on Don Lewis's relationships, daily interactions, and business connections, hoping that personal or financial context might reveal overlooked details. The absence of physical evidence made personal statements more important, prompting investigators to expand interviews to include family members, business partners, employees, acquaintances, and individuals who had interacted with Don in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. These interviews were conducted not to assign suspicion, but to construct a clearer view of his final movements, behaviors, and potential intentions. Detectives began by revisiting conversations Don had before his disappearance. Many described his behavior as routine. He talked about equipment, property deals, maintenance tasks, and issues at the wildlife sanctuary. Some noted he'd been increasingly interested in his Costa Rica investments, mentioning development opportunities and land use plans. Others said he had been preoccupied with ongoing business disputes. None indicated he had expressed fear, distress, or an intention to sever his responsibilities. Investigators then expanded their interviews to individuals involved in Don's real estate network. These associates varied widely: landlords, equipment traders, landowners, and informal business partners. Many had long-standing ties to Don, some stretching back 20 years or more. Their statements painted a picture of a businessman who frequently made deals based on handshake agreements, who managed properties without extensive documentation, and who sometimes shifted assets from one location to another with little notice. This pattern complicated efforts to identify whether any specific deal was linked to his disappearance, as many transactions lacked clear timelines or witnesses. One area of inquiry involved Don's interest in relocating to Costa Rica. Several individuals recalled him discussing the possibility of moving assets or establishing a more permanent presence there. Investigators contacted individuals connected to his Costa Rica properties, including caretakers and business contacts. These individuals provided consistent accounts. Don had not arrived, made no recent communications, and had not issued any instructions regarding property management. They had expected him to visit at some point in the future, but none believed he had immediate plans. This consistency strengthened the conclusion that Don had not traveled to Central America voluntarily. While these interviews produced clarity, they also generated contradictions. Some individuals reported that Don had been liquidating assets to support his Florida businesses, while others said he planned to shift more activity to Costa Rica. A few recalled unusual comments he made weeks earlier about wanting to make major changes in his life. Yet the context was vague and did not point toward any definitive plan. These inconsistencies were not dramatic enough to indicate deception, but they added complexity to the timeline. Investigators then began evaluating Don's personal relationships more closely, seeking to understand how those relationships intersected with his daily activities. His family interactions were reviewed, including recent conversations, financial arrangements, and shared responsibilities. Detectives sought to determine whether any personal disputes or private concerns might have contributed to his disappearance. These interviews produced a mixture of factual detail and subjective interpretation as individuals offered differing perspectives on Don's personal life. No single account provided a clear direction for investigators. During this phase, detectives also re-examined Don's logistical patterns. They traced his movements across multiple counties using receipts, handwritten notes, appointment reminders, and witness recollections. While they identified numerous places he had visited in previous weeks, none provided a significant lead. His activities mirrored previous months: property inspections, equipment trades, and meetings with business contacts. Nothing in his recent movements suggested preparation for disappearance, conflict, or an external threat. Meanwhile, interest in the case began to grow beyond law enforcement. Local media outlets took note of the unusual circumstances, reporting on the abandoned van at the airport and the absence of any clues. These stories prompted additional calls to investigators from individuals who believed they might have information, though none of these tips produced actionable leads. The case gradually entered regional awareness, adding another layer of pressure to the investigation. The media coverage also encouraged individuals who had interacted with Don in minor ways, at auctions, equipment yards, or property sites, to come forward. Some recalled seeing him days before his disappearance at a machinery sale. Others mentioned brief conversations that mirrored the accounts investigators had already gathered: routine, business-focused, and without any indication of impending danger. These interviews reinforced the same pattern. Jones' final days were consistent with his long-established habits. As investigators continued gathering testimony, they noticed discrepancies in perceptions rather than facts. Some individuals described Don as fatigued or distracted in the weeks prior, while others claimed he appeared energetic and focused on future plans. Some believed he was concerned about financial pressure, while others insisted he was optimistic about upcoming ventures. These contradictory subjective impressions made it difficult to assess his state of mind accurately. Detectives also expanded background checks on all individuals who had regular contact with Don. This process involved reviewing financial records, prior business disputes, legal filings, and property arrangements involving Don and others. While this revealed several civil disputes common in a business network as large as his, none appeared directly connected to his disappearance. These were routine disagreements over contracts, payments, and property boundaries, consistent with his line of work. Investigators then began analyzing Don's written notes and personal papers. He kept numerous handwritten lists containing names, amounts, reminders, and partial descriptions of deals. Many entries lacked dates or clear explanations, requiring investigators to cross-reference them with external records. The notebooks reflected his habit of juggling multiple responsibilities, but did not reveal any planned meetings or unusual activity tied to the 18th of August. Several business contacts were also located and interviewed in Costa Rica. They described past interactions, property plans, financial arrangements, and communication patterns with Don. Their accounts confirmed that while Don had significant interest in expanding his presence there, he had not communicated any immediate timeline or arranged for travel. None of these contacts reported receiving phone calls, letters, or emails from him around the time of his disappearance. As the interview phase expanded, investigators attempted to reconcile all information into a coherent sequence, but the contradictions became more pronounced. Don was described as both active and preoccupied, expanding and downsizing, planning future ventures and addressing present obligations. These inconsistencies reflected the complexity of his business and personal life, rather than providing clues. Despite thorough effort, detectives found no statement that pointed clearly toward voluntary disappearance, involuntary departure, or premeditated travel. As the investigation entered a more advanced phase, detectives broadened their methods to include deeper examination of Don Lewis's property holdings, financial structure, and business patterns. With no physical evidence, no sightings, and no witness accounts of his movements after the early hours of the 18th of August, investigators recognized that the disappearance could only be approached by dissecting every element of his life that produced observable data: his land, assets, recorded transactions, vehicles, storage units, and animal sanctuary operations. The goal was not only to search for evidence, but also to identify whether any hidden risks, disputes, or vulnerabilities had emerged within his network. The sheer number of properties reflected the scale of Don's business empire, but none yielded evidence that could be directly tied to the disappearance. Most locations showed no signs of activity outside of ordinary use. Abandoned or deteriorating structures offered no clues. Wells, cisterns, and ground depressions were examined with the assistance of technical teams equipped with cameras and probes, but all results were inconclusive. Nothing indicated that Don had visited any of these sites on the morning he vanished. Attention then shifted toward the wildlife sanctuary, which played a central role in Don's daily life. Although initial searches had revealed nothing unusual, investigators returned numerous times, expanding their inspection to include less used sections of the property. They checked equipment sheds, animal transport trailers, feed storage areas, and isolated enclosures located far from the main buildings. They inspected the perimeter fences, drainage areas, and wooded patches within the sanctuary acreage. These areas were searched for any indication of recent disturbance, tire imprints, soil movement, or tools out of place. But nothing meaningful emerged. The sanctuary grounds were consistent with normal daily operations. Detectives also reviewed animal care records, noting which enclosures had been serviced, which animals had been fed, and what personnel had been present during the days surrounding Don's disappearance. These records aligned with staff recollections and offered no anomalies. Investigators examined vehicles used for transporting animals, supplies, and equipment. All vehicles were accounted for, and none showed signs of unusual use. As physical searches continued, detectives deepened their examination of Don's finances, tracking accounts across local banks, credit institutions, business ledgers, and private hard copy documents. They analyzed deposit patterns, withdrawals, loan agreements, and property transfers. They reviewed checks written in the months leading up to the disappearance and contacted individuals named in those transactions. They found no large withdrawals or sudden shifts in financial behavior that would indicate an imminent departure. His accounts showed routine expenses consistent with his ongoing operation. Investigators then turned to Don's storage units, which contained tools, machinery parts, and miscellaneous items accumulated over years of business activity. The units were opened and searched thoroughly. Boxes were emptied, drawers were catalogued, and equipment was inspected. These searches were lengthy due to the volume of materials, but they revealed nothing suggestive of preparation, conflict, or concealment. Everything appeared consistent with his long-standing habit of storing items for potential future use. During this stage, detectives revisited Costa Rica a second time, reanalyzing Don's business presence there. They contacted government offices, airport authorities, property managers, and neighbors near his land. They checked bank activity, land registration, utility usage, and travel manifests. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Don had not arrived in Costa Rica and had not engaged in any activity there since his previous visit months earlier. His properties showed no signs of recent inspection, maintenance, or visitation. Individuals who had ongoing communication with him in the past reported complete silence after the disappearance. This reinforced the growing consensus that he had not traveled overseas voluntarily or via an unofficial route. The lack of movement in his financial and international records created new challenges. In many missing person cases involving business owners or individuals with international ties, investigators can track changes in account activity, credit usage, or property transfers that hint at motive or direction. Here, there were none. Everything remained static, reflecting ongoing business interrupted abruptly. As these investigations unfolded, detectives continued analyzing Don's network of professional relationships, hoping to identify any conflicts, disputes, or unusual interactions that might shed light on the disappearance. They reviewed past lawsuits, property disagreements, and financial disagreements. Several individuals had engaged in civil disputes with Don over the years, common for someone managing such a large set of properties. But none of the disputes showed signs of escalation in the weeks leading up to the 18th of August. Most were routine disagreements about payments, property boundaries, or contract terms. Interviews with those involved in these disputes revealed no indications of threats or unusual behavior. Despite the extensive efforts, the investigation remained anchored by a growing contradiction: the complete absence of evidence. For a man operating hundreds of acres of land, numerous vehicles, multiple storage units, and 2 countries' worth of business contacts, investigators expected at least a partial trail, a misplaced tool, a sighting, a receipt, a call, a record in Costa Rica, or an anomaly in financial behavior. Instead, every lead confirmed a sudden and unexplained halt in his activity. His life had been interrupted without any transitional signs. Detectives began to acknowledge that the lack of physical evidence was, in itself, becoming a central feature of the case. Most missing person investigations, even those involving deliberate disappearance, produce fragments of information: a witness account, a financial transaction, a vehicle sighting. Here, the absence was total. The disappearance had occurred between 2 locations, the sanctuary and the airport, without leaving any traceable path connecting them. This void complicated every theory under consideration. If Don had departed voluntarily, evidence of preparation should have existed. If he had suffered an accident, investigators expected physical traces. If he had encountered foul play, there should have been signs of disturbance or behavioral changes in individuals connected to him. Instead, nothing emerged. The case remained suspended between possibilities, each difficult to confirm and equally difficult to dismiss. As days shifted into weeks and the investigation extended beyond its initial intensity, the search for Don Lewis entered a long-term phase characterized by repeated sweeps of familiar locations, expansion into new areas, and continued attempts to identify an overlooked detail. The early urgency had transitioned into sustained, methodical work that required investigators to revisit ground already covered. Not because they expected dramatically different results, but because the absence of evidence left them with no alternative but to continue cycling through possibilities. One of the primary tasks involved returning to the sanctuary and its surrounding land. Although it had been searched extensively during the first days of the investigation, detectives recognized that the property's size, combined with its wooded patches, storage areas, and irregular terrain, made it susceptible to overlooked details. Teams walked the same paths multiple times, inspecting enclosures, buildings, and equipment yards. They examined drainage ditches, fence lines, and low-lying areas where rainwater could shift soil or obscure small objects. Even the animal enclosures, though unlikely to be relevant, were checked again to ensure no environmental disturbance had occurred. Each renewed inspection confirmed what earlier searches had shown: no sign of Don, no indication of struggle, and no unexplained activity. The repeated sanctuary sweeps were accompanied by revisits to other properties in Don's portfolio. This included agricultural fields, wooded lots, undeveloped tracts, and parcels with older structures. These visits were prompted partly by environmental changes. Vegetation growth, rainfall, and shifting soil sometimes reveal or conceal details. Investigators looked for anything newly exposed: footprints hardened in dried mud, disturbed brush, shallow depressions in the ground, or small items near building foundations. Despite the expanded scope, the land remained unchanged, offering no new information. Search teams also refocused on the airport area, re-examining the immediate grounds and the rural terrain surrounding the runway. Detectives walked along the tree lines, drainage channels, and access roads that bordered the airport property. They searched ditches overgrown with grass, small clusters of palmetto, and sandy patches between the access road and nearby residential lots. They looked for shoe impressions, discarded objects, or any sign that someone had traveled on foot. Each sweep ended with the same conclusion: the area offered no tangible clues. Wind patterns, soil composition, and lack of foot traffic meant that anything left behind would have been noticeable, but nothing appeared out of place. During this period, environmental analysis played an increasingly important role. Investigators consulted specialists familiar with Florida's rural terrain, including environmental officers and search and rescue professionals. They examined how soil compaction, vegetation growth, animal movement, and seasonal weather patterns could influence the preservation or disappearance of evidence. They evaluated whether wildlife activity could move or obscure items, and whether heavy summer rains could contribute to erosion or flooding in low areas. However, even these assessments suggested that if Don had collapsed, fallen, or suffered an accident near the airport or along a walking route, some physical trace should have remained. The complete absence of footprints, fabric, or personal items continued to stand out. This absence increased the pressure to consider broader theories. One theory involved the possibility that Don had used another vehicle after leaving the van at the airport. This scenario required him to meet someone, whether intentionally or unexpectedly. Investigators looked for witness statements about unfamiliar vehicles parked at the airport, drivers seen early in the morning, or cars traveling slowly near the entrance. Door-to-door inquiries were conducted in nearby residential pockets and businesses, but no witness recalled seeing Don or any unusual vehicle at that time. Another theory considered whether Don had experienced a medical emergency after parking the van. If he had become disoriented and walked into unfamiliar terrain, investigators expected at least some physical evidence. Cadaver dogs, deployed again during this phase, conducted new sweeps under varying weather conditions. Dogs trained to detect scent across large areas examined open fields, patches of dense vegetation, and wooded sections around the airport. These dogs were highly experienced and capable of detecting scent over long distances. Yet none made a reliable alert. As months passed, the investigation confronted a recurring challenge. Every theory required evidence, yet none existed. This led detectives to broaden their inquiries into Don's business world once more. They examined partnerships, agreements, and conflicts that might suggest financial motivation or external involvement. Several business contacts were re-interviewed to verify earlier statements. Investigators reviewed property transfers, loan arrangements, and verbal agreements preserved in documents or handwritten notes. They checked whether any significant disputes had escalated in the days before the disappearance. These reviews revealed routine disagreements typical of Don's broad dealings, but no indicators of imminent conflict. Investigators also returned to Costa Rica, leads repeating checks with airport officials, immigration officers, and individuals connected to Don's properties. They confirmed again that no travel records, formal or informal, placed Don in the country. His land there remained undisturbed, and no utilities or property taxes showed changes in activity that would suggest preparation or concealment. His rather extensive investments in the region gave investigators plenty of material to examine, yet none of it bore any connections to the 18th of August. Even unofficial landing sites and private farm strips were reviewed. But these efforts yielded nothing. At this stage, detectives began compiling a list of key contradictions that defined the investigation. He vanished between two known locations without leaving a trace on either end. His van was found neatly parked, but no one saw him arrive or leave. He did not bring his passport, yet he owned property abroad. He conducted ongoing business but made no arrangements for future responsibilities. He had expressed interest in Costa Rica, but had no documented travel plans. He left no physical trail, digital footprint, or financial pattern. He had hundreds of assets, yet no sign emerged from any of them. These contradictions did not point toward a single theory, rather, they undermined all of them simultaneously. A voluntary disappearance would leave preparation. An accident would leave remains or objects. Foul play would produce signs of struggle or suspicious behavior. None were present. As the search expanded into its later stages, investigators recognized that each new area covered only reinforced how unusual the case truly was. The land around the airport remained open and unaltered. The sanctuary remained orderly and undisturbed. Don's properties remained unchanged, and his business networks showed no activity or communication from him. As the investigation into Don Lewis's disappearance entered the months following the initial search, the case gradually shifted from an active field operation into a broader inquiry defined by legal actions, conflicting recollections, and increasing public attention. The absence of physical evidence forced investigators to rely more heavily on interviews, document analysis, and indirect clues that might offer new angles. However, rather than narrowing the scope, the investigation expanded into wider layers of Don's personal, financial, and business life, creating an increasingly complex landscape. One of the earliest developments involved the growing number of legal and administrative tasks tied to Don's extensive property holdings. With his whereabouts unknown, lawyers, business partners, and property managers began seeking clarification about the status of contracts, rentals, loans, and agreements. These inquiries drew attention to the sheer scale of Don's operations, dozens of properties, ongoing deals, and financial relationships that required oversight. The legal structures surrounding these assets were not centralized, making it challenging for investigators to identify who had access to what information. This process led to further interviews, not only with business contacts, but also with attorneys, accountants, and individuals responsible for property maintenance. Each provided fragmented insights into Don's routines, obligations, and long-term plans. During this phase, investigators revisited statements from individuals closest to Don, including those involved in the management of the wildlife sanctuary. These interviews were expanded in scope to include detailed timelines, recollections of conversations, and clarifications of events leading up to the disappearance. Detectives sought consistency across accounts to determine whether any contradiction signaled misunderstanding or deliberate omission. However, the interviews produced conflicting interpretations of Don's state of mind. Some individuals recalled him as focused and engaged in his business ventures. Others suggested he had been more distracted in the weeks before the disappearance. These subjective inconsistencies made it difficult to establish a definitive assessment of his intentions. Investigators also examined Doan's Costa Rica interests more deeply. They reviewed his land purchases, tax records, and legal filings associated with his properties there. They contacted individuals who had helped facilitate land acquisitions, managed construction efforts, or handled maintenance tasks. These contacts confirmed that Don had plans for further development, though none could identify any scheduled travel or immediate obligations. Some recalled discussions about relocating animals or assets, while others understood his interest as purely speculative. The variety of interpretations underscored the challenge investigators faced. Don had broad ambitions, but he communicated them differently to different people. Meanwhile, public and media awareness of the case expanded. Local outlets reported on the unusual disappearance, highlighting the lack of evidence and the abandoned van at the airport. These reports generated new tips and inquiries, many from individuals who hoped their information might be relevant. Some callers reported seeing men matching Doan's description in unrelated locations. Others speculated about possible international movements. Investigators followed every reasonable lead, but none were verifiable. A number of the tips involved sightings after the disappearance, but these were dismissed when no supporting evidence emerged. As the media coverage grew, information about Doan's disappearance entered regional and eventually national news cycles. This increased attention brought scrutiny to his business practices, family relationships, and the wildlife sanctuary operations. Investigators found themselves responding to speculation, clarifying rumors, and distinguishing fact from conjecture. While the publicity occasionally produced new leads, it also complicated the investigation by amplifying unverified information. Detectives maintained focus on verifiable data, avoiding reliance on speculation unless it could be supported by evidence. In this period, detectives also began reviewing Doan's legal history, including civil disputes and property conflicts. These records revealed a pattern common among individuals managing large portfolios, disagreements over contracts, property boundaries, payments, and lease terms. Investigators examined whether any dispute had escalated beyond routine disagreement, but none appeared unusually contentious in the months before his disappearance. Business contact interviews confirmed that while Don engaged in numerous negotiations, none involved threats or confrontations that could be directly linked to the case. Investigators turned next to Don's personal records. They examined handwritten notes, calendars, appointment reminders, and business journals found across his properties. These documents offered insights into his daily activities, but lacked the detail necessary to track his movements in the day before he disappeared. Many entries referenced equipment repairs, property improvements, and routine business tasks. A few mentioned Costa Rica, reflecting ongoing interest, but none suggested immediate travel. The informal nature of Don's record-keeping made it difficult to draw precise conclusions. One of the investigative angles involved mapping Don's travel habits. Detectives established that he typically informed at least one person when flying to Costa Rica, even if travel plans were loosely organized. Records from prior trips indicated he relied on commercial flights or chartered options, but these always required a passport. Given that his passport remained at home, investigators concluded that any voluntary travel was highly unlikely. They reviewed flight logs, charter services, and private aviation contacts throughout Central Florida. None reported recent activity involving Don. During this extended phase, law enforcement continued periodic searches of properties and surrounding areas, especially after significant rainfall or weather changes that might uncover buried or obscured evidence. Deputies returned to fields that had recently been plowed, wooded areas after seasonal thinning, and ditches following heavy storms. These seasonal checks were part of standard procedure in complex missing person cases, but they repeatedly produced no discoveries As more time passed, investigators increasingly focused on the unusual nature of the case's silence. Most missing person investigations eventually produce some trace, a witness account, an object found on a roadside, a financial anomaly, a document showing preparation. Don Lewis's disappearance produced none. This absolute absence created an investigative vacuum where typical indicators of travel, conflict, or accident were missing. Detectives discussed whether the van's presence at the airport represented misdirection, coincidence, or an endpoint. Yet without evidence, they could only acknowledge that the vehicle provided a location, but not a narrative. The contradictions grew more pronounced. Don had expressed interest in Costa Rica but did not bring his passport. He managed numerous properties but left no written instructions. He traveled frequently but made no preparations. He handled cash often but removed none from his accounts. He engaged in wide-ranging business activities but left every one of them unresolved. As months turned into years, the weight of these contradictions pushed the investigation into a long-term posture. A case reviewed regularly, examined whenever new information emerged, yet still defined by the absence at its core. No evidence of travel, no indication of accident, no trace of struggle, no unusual financial movements, no credible witness sightings, no definitive explanation. As the investigation moved into the years following Don Lewis's disappearance, the case settled into a long-term cycle of periodic reassessment, renewed searches, advanced technology applications, and repeated examinations of the same unanswered questions. The initial urgency had passed, but the case remained active, anchored by the unresolved contradictions and the complete lack of physical evidence. Each passing year added layers of analysis but produced no definitive answers. Law enforcement began by conducting more thorough financial audits. With more time and resources, investigators could examine Don's accounts in greater detail, cross-referencing payments, deposits, land titles, and informal loans. They worked with financial analysts to reconstruct Don's business activities from months prior to his disappearance. This included mapping income from property rentals, reviewing bank statements from multiple institutions, and verifying the legitimacy of transactions involving equipment and land. Despite this extensive review, auditors found no unusual withdrawals, no large cash movements, and no hidden accounts. Don's financial activity prior to disappearance was entirely consistent with his ongoing business operations. There was no indication of planning for a long-term absence or a relocation, voluntary or otherwise. Investigators also expanded background inquiries into Don's associates, revisiting individuals who had interacted with him regularly. They checked for financial disputes, outstanding debts, or personal conflicts that could have escalated. They reviewed civil court filings, property disagreements, and contractual records involving Don and others. These investigations confirmed what earlier reviews had suggested. Don had many routine disagreements, but none showed evidence of escalation or threats. No one interviewed claimed to have had a recent conflict with him, and no records suggested that any business relationship had deteriorated to the point of danger. As time progressed and technology improved, law enforcement used new tools to revisit areas connected to the case. Aerial search methods benefited from improved resolution and imaging software. Drones equipped with high-definition cameras and thermal sensors were deployed over several of Don's properties, the area surrounding the airport, and undeveloped land in Pasco and Hillsborough counties. These tools could detect soil disturbances, changes in vegetation growth, or anomalies in ground temperature that might hint at buried objects or concealed areas. The searches revealed nothing unusual. Every scan reinforced the conclusion that no physical evidence had been hidden or overlooked. Cadaver dogs were brought back over the years, especially during environmental shifts, such as dry seasons, heavy rainfall, or periods when vegetation died back. These seasonal conditions can reveal scents or expose features on the ground that were previously concealed. Handlers conducted searches around the sanctuary, adjacent lands, wooded regions near the airport, and isolated farms. The dogs occasionally showed interest in unrelated animal remains or natural features, but never made credible alerts connected to Don. Each sweep reaffirmed the same silence that had characterized the early months. During this stage, law enforcement also reviewed electronic records again, focusing on call logs, bank records, and historical travel documentation. Although the late 1990s lacked the type of digital monitoring available today, investigators still analyzed what data was available. There were no phone calls placed by Don after his disappearance, no travel confirmations, and no digital records indicating movement. Every formal and informal pathway for tracking his activities led to the same endpoint, the 18th of August, with nothing afterward. As the case persisted without progress, public interest intensified. Documentaries, articles, and investigative programs began covering the disappearance, introducing the case to national audiences. These programs raised awareness, but also encouraged speculation, leading to a flood of tips and theories sent to law enforcement. Some callers claimed to have spotted Don in various locations across the country. Others offered theories linking his disappearance to business disputes, international travel, or personal conflict. Investigators followed the most plausible leads, but none produced verifiable evidence. Most sightings were impossible to confirm or involved individuals who only resembled Don. Public theories often reflected the complexity of the case. Some speculated that Don had left voluntarily to escape financial or personal pressures. Others believed he attempted to travel to Costa Rica through unrecorded means. Still others proposed theories involving business partners or unknown adversaries. However, without physical evidence, these theories remained speculative. Investigators continually stressed that no credible information supported any specific theory, and the absence of evidence prevented forming definitive conclusions. Law enforcement also conducted internal reassessments of the case, reviewing documentation, timelines, interviews, and fieldwork. Cold case specialists evaluated the investigation from an external perspective, looking for overlooked inconsistencies or missed opportunities. They revisited the timeline, examined Don's known behaviors, and re-evaluated the significance of the van found at the airport. They analyzed whether the van's location reflected intentional placement, misdirection, or an abandoned plan. Yet the reviews consistently led to the same uncertainty. The van remained the only concrete data point, and it provided no further clues. In the years following the disappearance, investigators also revisited the possibility of Don having experienced a medical emergency. They consulted medical professionals regarding scenarios where sudden health events might cause confusion or disorientation. However, any such event should have left behind physical evidence, a body, clothing, or personal items. Especially in the areas searched extensively by ground teams, helicopters, and dogs, the total absence of remains significantly undermined this theory. Florida's terrain, especially around the airport and surrounding areas, does not conceal remains easily without environmental or human interference. The land was searched too thoroughly for an accidental collapse to remain entirely undetected. Investigators also considered the possibility of Don having left the van and entering another vehicle, voluntarily or otherwise. This scenario required that someone met him at the airport, either through prearrangement or unexpected interactions. Detectives reviewed records of vehicles entering or exiting nearby properties, spoke with residents along surrounding roads, and analyzed any known presence of neighbors or workers near the airfield during the early morning hours. However, the time of day, before sunrise, greatly limited potential witnesses. No accounts surfaced that mentioned seeing Don or any unknown vehicles. With time, law enforcement also began to acknowledge that the disappearance had become defined not by evidence, but by the consistent absence of it. In typical missing person investigations, even cases involving deliberate concealment or foul play, some fragment almost always emerges: a discarded item, a financial transaction, a witness sighting, a record showing attempted contact. The complete lack of such indicators in Don Lewis's case elevated its complexity. Investigators noted that no scenario, voluntary departure, accident, or criminal act fully aligned with the facts as they were known. As years continued to pass, the case remained open, but investigators recognized that progress depended on new information, new technology, or an unexpected discovery. Regular reviews kept the case active, but each new examination confirmed that the disappearance defied conventional investigative patterns. Despite the extensive searches, advanced tools, and years of analysis, no answer emerged. No new evidence surfaced on Don's properties, no sightings were confirmed, and no financial or travel activity indicated movement. The investigation remained defined by the same silence that began on the morning of the 18th of August, 1997. In the years following Don Lewis's disappearance, the case transitioned fully into long-term investigative maintenance, a status reserved for unresolved missing person files that continue to generate questions but produce no new evidence. The initial search operations, the broad investigative sweeps, and the extensive interviews had yielded nothing definitive. With time, the case entered a new phase shaped by legal processes, administrative decisions, ongoing media scrutiny, and periodic re-examinations by law enforcement. The disappearance remained active, yet fundamentally unchanged from the moment Don vanished on the 18th of August, 1997. One of the earliest long-term developments involved Don's estate. As months passed with no updates on his whereabouts, the legal responsibilities associated with his property portfolio, business holdings, and financial commitments required formal handling. Florida law necessitates specific procedures when an individual is missing but not declared deceased, and these procedures often unfold slowly. The complexity of Don's holdings, spanning numerous counties, multiple business entities, international interests, and informal arrangements, added significant difficulty to the probate process. Attorneys, property managers, and financial advisors worked through deeds, contracts, and documents to determine which properties required maintenance, which businesses needed oversight, and which agreements remained unresolved. During this period, a court-approved conservator was appointed to manage Don's estate. The conservatorship involved cataloging assets, stabilizing property conditions, addressing outstanding financial obligations, and ensuring that any ongoing business activity was conducted legally. Investigators monitored these proceedings closely, as estate disputes sometimes reveal underlying tensions or information relevant to an individual's disappearance. In Don's case, the extensive paperwork provided a clearer understanding of his business operations, but offered no new evidence related to the disappearance. His estate records remained consistent with what investigators had seen from his active business life: complex, layered, and heavily dependent on his personal oversight. As part of the long-term legal process, Don was eventually declared legally dead 5 years after his disappearance, following Florida statutory guidelines. This legal declaration was procedural rather than investigative. It did not imply a conclusion about what had happened, but was necessary for resolving property transfers, financial accounts, and business matters left incomplete. The declaration allowed the estate to be settled, but it did not provide answers to the central question of his whereabouts. During this period, the case also underwent multiple cold case reviews. These reviews were conducted by detectives not involved in the original investigation, providing new perspectives on existing evidence. Cold case teams re-examined the timeline, evaluated investigative strategies, and assessed whether any old leads could benefit from newer technologies. They reviewed the airport findings, searched for overlooked inconsistencies in witness statements, and analyzed legal records and property documents again. In each review, specialists attempted to identify gaps in the investigation or evidence that might have gained relevance over time. However, these reviews consistently reached the same conclusion. The case lacked the physical or informational foundation necessary to pivot in a new direction. Public interest continued to grow as the years passed. True crime communities, documentary producers, and investigative journalists revisited the case, analyzing available information and speculating about plausible scenarios. The story circulated widely due to the unusual combination of factors: the van at the airport with no corresponding flight activity, the absence of personal items, the incomplete nature of Don's business records, and the international property interests. Public discussions often highlighted theories that law enforcement had already explored thoroughly. Despite the increasing attention, none of the public theories produced verifiable evidence, and investigators maintained caution against speculation overshadowing factual analysis. Throughout this long-term phase, law enforcement maintained the case as open and unresolved. Detectives continued to field tips from the public, evaluate new information, and respond to inquiries. Most tips were reviewed and dismissed due to lack of credibility or relevance. Others involved potential sightings in the United States or Latin America, but none were corroborated by documents, travel records, or witnesses. Investigators also monitored unidentified remains cases across the region. When remains were found that matched Don's general demographic profile, they were cross-checked using available identifiers. None matched. With each passing year, the absence of evidence remained one of the most distinctive features of the case. Most disappearances, whether voluntary, accidental, or criminal, produce some trace over time. Belongings are found, remains surface, financial activity provides clues, or witness accounts emerge. In Don Lewis's case, nothing surfaced in the years following the disappearance. His properties remained unchanged, his financial records stagnant, and his international holdings inactive. His private, informal agreements, once a dynamic part of his business style, provided no pathway to understanding his last movements. As environmental conditions changed across his properties and surrounding regions, law enforcement occasionally conducted renewed searches. These were particularly common after natural events, storms, floods, brush clearing, or land development projects that might reveal areas previously obscured. Each renewed search confirmed the same result: no sign of Don, no evidence left behind, and no disturbance that could be connected to the disappearance. After more than 2 decades, the land still held no answers. The continued absence of evidence prompted investigators to reevaluate the broader context of the case. They revisited the initial contradiction. Don had left behind a complex, active life with numerous responsibilities, yet nothing indicated preparation for long-term departure. They also reconsidered the context of the van at the airport. If it represented a deliberate choice, it lacked the markers of planned travel. If it represented misdirection, there was no trace of the individual responsible. If it represented an incomplete plan, nothing suggested what the next step had been. Over time, the case entered public memory as one of Florida's most enduring unresolved disappearances. It illustrated the challenges of investigating a missing person case without physical evidence, clear witnesses, or digital trails. Despite technological advancements, renewed investigative effort, and extensive public interest, no additional information emerged to clarify Don's fate. Today, the disappearance of Don Lewis remains open with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Investigators continue to accept and review new information whenever it is provided. The case remains unresolved, defined by the same silence and absence that marked its earliest days. No evidence has surfaced to indicate where Don went, how he left the airport, or what occurred after he parked his van. His disappearance stands as an open question, one rooted in an ordinary morning that left behind no trace and no explanation. The unresolved nature of the case continues to underscore its complexity. Don Lewis's disappearance remains suspended in uncertainty, a rare instance where decades of searching, reviewing, and revisiting have produced no definitive answers. Despite broad investigative effort, the case concludes not with resolution, but with enduring ambiguity, marked by the unanswered question of what happened on the 18th of August, 1997.